On the afternoon before the world changed forever, nothing seemed unusual. The man who would later become known as the last confirmed person to see Michael Jackson alive had no idea that history was quietly unfolding around him. At the time, it felt like just another day inside a world that had become increasingly isolated, controlled, and difficult for outsiders to understand. Michael Jackson was only days away from what many believed would be the greatest comeback of his career. After years of controversy, financial struggles, and public scrutiny, he was preparing for a series of concerts that carried enormous expectations. Thousands of fans were waiting. Industry executives were watching closely. The media was already predicting either a triumphant return or a disastrous collapse. Behind the scenes, however, very few people truly knew what was happening. The public saw headlines, they saw rehearsals, they saw promotional images that suggested confidence and determination. But inside Michael's private circle, there were growing concerns that rarely reached the outside world. Some people believed he was pushing himself too hard. Others insisted he was energized and fully committed. Conflicting stories surrounded nearly every aspect of his final weeks. That uncertainty only grew after his sudden death. For years, countless theories emerged. Fans analyzed photographs. Former associates gave interviews. Witnesses offered different versions of events. Every new claim seemed to create even more questions than answers. Yet one mystery remained particularly fascinating. Who was the final person to see Michael Jackson alive? The answer appeared simple at first. Several individuals were present during the final hours. Security personnel moved through the property. Medical staff came and went. Assistants handled daily responsibilities. Yet as investigators pieced together the timeline, attention repeatedly returned to one individual whose account would become central to understanding what happened during those final moments. For a long time, portions of that story remained largely hidden from public view. Years passed, interest never disappeared. Instead, Michael Jackson's legacy seemed to grow larger with time. New generations discovered his music, documentaries revisited his life. Former friends and colleagues began sharing memories that had remained private for decades. Amid all of this, the mystery surrounding his final hours continued to attract attention. Then something unexpected happened. Details that had rarely been discussed publicly started resurfacing. Interviews were re-examined, statements were compared. Small pieces of information that once seemed insignificant suddenly carried new meaning when viewed together. What emerged was not the dramatic scene many people expected. It was something far more unsettling. Because according to the person who claims to have seen Michael Jackson during his final conscious moments, there were subtle signs that, in hindsight, seemed impossible to ignore. At the time, nobody fully understood what they meant. But after everything that followed, those final observations would become impossible to forget. And they would raise a troubling question that still divides people today. Was Michael Jackson's death truly as unexpected as the world was led to believe? In the months leading up to the planned concert series, Michael Jackson was living under a level of pressure few people could truly comprehend. To the public, the upcoming performances represented a spectacular return. The announcement had triggered excitement across the world. Tickets disappeared almost instantly. Fans traveled from different countries, hoping to witness what many believed could be the final major chapter of his career. What most people didn't realize was that the project had grown far beyond its original scope. The concerts were initially intended to be a limited engagement. As demand exploded, additional dates were added, production costs increased. Expectations climbed higher with every passing week. What began as a comeback was slowly transforming into one of the most ambitious live entertainment productions ever attempted. Behind the curtain, preparations consumed nearly every hour of Michael's life. Rehearsals stretched late into the night. Choreographers refined routines repeatedly. Designers adjusted costumes. Technicians tested elaborate stage effects that had never been attempted before. Every detail was scrutinized because everyone involved understood that audiences expected perfection. And perfection was something Michael Jackson had spent his entire life chasing. Those who worked with him often described an artist who could never stop refining his work. A song could always sound better. A dance move could always become sharper. A performance could always feel more magical. That relentless pursuit had helped transform him into a global icon, but it also carried a cost. As the opening date approached, people inside the production began noticing signs of exhaustion. Some recalled days when Michael appeared energetic and deeply engaged. Others remembered moments when he seemed unusually quiet. Accounts varied depending on who was speaking, creating a confusing picture that would later become one of the biggest challenges for investigators trying to reconstruct his final weeks. Adding to the uncertainty was the increasingly private nature of his life. Unlike earlier periods of his career, Michael rarely allowed outsiders into his personal world. Access was tightly controlled. Conversations often passed through intermediaries. Even individuals working closely with him sometimes struggled to understand what was happening beyond rehearsals and official meetings. As a result, rumors flourished. Stories circulated about financial concerns, others focused on health issues. Some claimed he was stronger than he had been in years. Others suggested the opposite. Separating fact from speculation became nearly impossible. Yet amid all the conflicting narratives, one detail remained consistent. Michael was determined to reach opening night. People who spent time around him described someone who understood the significance of the upcoming performances. These shows were more than concerts. They represented an opportunity to redefine how the world remembered him. After decades of extraordinary success mixed with controversy and public scrutiny, this was his chance to control the narrative once again. That determination became especially visible during rehearsals. Witnesses later described moments when Michael appeared completely transformed. Instant music began playing. Fatigue seemed to disappear. Focus returned. The performer who had captivated millions emerged once more. But when the music stopped, a different reality sometimes appeared. And according to several people who were present during those final days, the contrast between those two versions of Michael Jackson was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The person who would eventually become known as the last individual to see him alive witnessed that contrast firsthand. At the time, it seemed like a small detail. Later, it would become one of the most haunting memories from the final chapter of Michael Jackson's life. The closer the opening night approached, the more complicated the situation became. From the outside, preparations appeared to be moving exactly as planned. Rehearsal footage showed Michael Jackson dancing, directing performers, and discussing creative ideas with remarkable attention to detail. To fans who caught brief glimpses through leaked videos and media reports, he looked focused on delivering another unforgettable spectacle. But behind those carefully managed images, concerns continued to surface. Not everyone interpreted the signs the same way. Some members of the production team believed the intense schedule was simply taking its toll. After all, the scale of the upcoming shows was enormous. Long rehearsals, constant meetings, travel arrangements, and endless creative decisions would have exhausted almost anyone. Others, however, felt something deeper was happening. Years later, several individuals would describe moments that made them uneasy at the time, but seemed far more significant in hindsight. Small observations, brief conversations, unexpected changes in behavior. None of them appeared dramatic on their own, yet together they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. One recurring theme appeared in multiple accounts. Michael often seemed caught between two worlds. When cameras were present or rehearsals were underway, he could appear energized, focused, and fully committed to the project. He would discuss stage effects, refine choreography, and push performers toward the exact standard he envisioned. Colleagues frequently described these moments as reminders of the legendary entertainer they had admired for decades. Yet away from the spotlight, the atmosphere sometimes shifted. Several people later recalled periods when Michael seemed unusually withdrawn. Conversations became shorter. Meetings occasionally ended earlier than expected. At times, he appeared preoccupied by thoughts he chose not to share. No one knew exactly what was weighing on him. Some believed financial pressures remained a constant source of stress. Others pointed to the enormous responsibility attached to the comeback itself. A few suspected personal concerns that never became public knowledge. The truth was buried beneath layers of speculation. Then came a series of events that would later attract intense scrutiny. The days before his death, those closest to the production noticed growing urgency surrounding preparations. Deadlines were approaching. Expectations continued to rise. Every department was racing against the clock to ensure the opening performance met the extraordinary standards associated with Michael Jackson's name. The pressure was no longer building gradually, it was accelerating. And according to individuals who were there, Michael seemed fully aware of it. He spoke frequently about the future. He discussed plans extending well beyond the first performances. New ideas continued to emerge. Creative concepts were still being developed. By all appearances, he was looking ahead rather than preparing for an ending. That made what happened next even more difficult to understand. Because as investigators later reconstructed the final timeline, they discovered something unusual about Michael's last public appearances and private interactions. There was no obvious farewell, no final announcement, no dramatic indication that the world was about to lose one of its most recognizable figures. Instead, everything seemed surprisingly ordinary. Perhaps that is why the memories of those final encounters became so important. Among all the witnesses, one individual stood out because they spent time with Michael during the critical hours before everything changed. Their observations were simple, almost routine. Yet years later, those details would become some of the most closely examined pieces of the entire story. And as that person would eventually reveal, one particular moment from their final conversation never stopped haunting them. At the time, it felt insignificant. Later, it would feel like a warning that nobody recognized until it was far too late. The final week before first concert was supposed to mark the beginning of Michael Jackson's return. Instead, it would become the beginning of one of the most debated timelines in entertainment history. As rehearsals intensified, those around Michael found themselves witnessing a strange contradiction. On certain nights, he appeared remarkably engaged. Video recordings from the period show him moving across the stage, discussing lighting cues, and offering detailed instructions to dancers and musicians. His commitment to the production seemed undeniable. Yet beneath the surface, concerns continued to grow. People who interacted with him privately later described a man carrying an invisible burden. It wasn't necessarily one dramatic issue. Rather, it seemed like the combined weight of years of expectations, responsibilities, and constant public scrutiny pressing down all at once. What made the situation particularly confusing was that Michael rarely spoke openly about his struggles. Those closest to him often had to interpret his mood through brief comments, expressions, or changes in behavior. Direct explanations were rare. Instead, people were left trying to understand what he might have been feeling based on fragments. That uncertainty followed everyone into the final days. Then came the rehearsal that many participants would never forget. Witnesses described Michael as focused and determined throughout much of the evening. He reviewed performances, adjusted details, and discussed creative elements with the same perfectionist mindset that had defined his entire career. Several individuals later recalled being impressed by how invested he seemed, despite the demanding schedule. For a few hours, everything appeared normal. In fact, some people would later say it was one of the strongest rehearsals they had seen from him during preparations. That observation would become important later, because it directly conflicted with assumptions that emerged after his death. If Michael was struggling so severely, how had he managed to perform at such a high level only hours earlier? The question fueled years of debate. But while the public focused on rehearsal footage, investigators became interested in something else entirely. What happened after the cameras stopped recording? As the evening came to an end, the atmosphere gradually changed. Crew members began leaving. Equipment was secured. Conversations wound down. One by one, people departed, assuming they would see Michael again the following day. Nobody imagined they had just witnessed one of his final public appearances. Among those remaining, however, was an individual whose role would soon place them at the center of an international mystery. This person spent time with Michael during the crucial hours that followed. Unlike rehearsal footage or official schedules, their account offered a rare glimpse into what occurred when the crowds disappeared and the performer stepped away from the stage. For years, portions of that account remained buried beneath legal proceedings, media speculation, and competing narratives. But when details eventually surfaced, they painted a surprisingly human picture. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand predictions, no indication that history was only hours away. Instead, the final interactions seemed almost ordinary. Michael reportedly discussed future plans. He talked about upcoming performances. He focused on details that needed attention. Everything suggested a man looking forward rather than backward, yet one observation stood out. The witness later recalled noticing something unusual about Michael's condition that night. It wasn't dramatic enough to trigger alarm. It wasn't severe enough to stop preparations, but it was memorable enough that years later, it remained impossible to forget. At the time, the details seemed insignificant. After his death, it became deeply unsettling, because if that observation had been fully understood in the moment, some believe the events that followed might have unfolded very differently. And according to the witness, the most revealing part of the story was still yet to happen. As news of Michael Jackson's death spread across the world, confusion arrived before clarity. Within minutes, phone calls began racing between executives, family members, production staff, security personnel, and reporters. Rumors spread faster than confirmed information. Television networks interrupted programming. Radio stations switched to non-stop coverage. Millions of people were suddenly trying to understand how a man preparing for a historic comeback could be gone so unexpectedly. But while the public searched for answers, those who had seen Michael during his final hours were struggling with a different reality. They were replaying every moment in their minds, every conversation, every observation, every decision. The individual believed to have been among the last people to see Michael alive later described an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Like many others, they initially assumed there had been some kind of misunderstanding. The events simply didn't seem to fit with what they had witnessed only hours earlier. Michael had been making plans. He had been discussing future performances. He had been focused on work. Nothing about those conversations suggested an ending. That contradiction became increasingly difficult to reconcile as more information emerged. Investigators began reconstructing a minute-by-minute timeline of the final hours. Witness statements were collected. Phone records were examined. Schedules were reviewed. Medical details became the subject of intense scrutiny. The process revealed a complex picture. Many assumptions circulating in the media proved incomplete. Certain rumors were dismissed. Other claims gained credibility. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more attention shifted toward the environment surrounding Michael during the final stages of preparation for the comeback. Pressure, exhaustion, expectations. Each factor appeared repeatedly throughout witness accounts. The person who spent time with Michael shortly before his death remembered one detail in particular that became impossible to ignore afterward. According to their account, Michael seemed intensely determined to continue moving forward despite obvious challenges. He remained focused on the concerts. He wanted the performances to succeed. He wanted audiences to experience something unforgettable. That determination impressed many people around him. But in hindsight, some wondered whether it also prevented others from fully recognizing how much strain he may have been under. The witness later admitted that nothing they observed seemed serious enough to trigger immediate alarm. If it had, they would have acted differently. Yet, after learning what happened, ordinary moments suddenly appeared far more significant. A brief pause during conversation, a visible sign of fatigue, a comment that seemed harmless at the time. The problem with hindsight is that it often creates connections nobody can see in real time, and that is exactly what happened. As months turned into years, public fascination with Michael's final days only intensified. Court proceedings introduced new information. Former associates gave interviews. Experts analyzed evidence. Every development added another layer to an already complicated story. Still, one question refused to disappear. Could anyone have seen what was coming? For some observers, the answer remained no. They believed the tragedy unfolded too quickly and unpredictably. Others argued that warning signs had existed all along, hidden within the chaos surrounding the comeback preparations. The witness found themselves caught between those perspectives. They knew what they had seen. They knew what they had not seen. And perhaps most importantly, they knew how ordinary that final encounter had felt. That realization became one of the most haunting aspects of the entire story. Because the closer people examined Michael Jackson's last days, the more they discovered a troubling truth. The greatest clues may not have been hidden in dramatic events at all. They may have been concealed inside moments that appeared completely normal until it was far too late to understand what they meant. And as investigators continued uncovering details, the story was approaching its most shocking turning point. Years after Michael Jackson's death, investigators, journalists, former associates, and fans were still trying to piece together the final puzzle. By then, countless documents had been reviewed, witnesses had spoken publicly, court proceedings had revealed details that were once hidden from view. Yet despite all of that information, one reality remained unchanged. Nobody could turn back the clock. The person believed to be among the last to see Michael alive eventually came to a conclusion shared by many others who had been close to the situation. The tragedy wasn't defined by a single moment, it was the result of many different factors converging at the same time. The enormous pressure surrounding the comeback, the expectations attached to his legacy, the physical demands of preparing for a production on a historic scale, the years of personal and professional struggles that had accumulated long before the concerts were announced. Each piece formed part of a much larger story. When the witness reflected on their final interaction with Michael, they didn't describe a man preparing for the end of his life. Quite the opposite. They described someone focused on the future, someone discussing upcoming performances, someone still thinking creatively, someone who believed there was more work to do. That may be why the memory remained so difficult to process, because the final conversation contained none of the dramatic elements people often expect from the closing chapter of a famous life. There were no prophetic statements, no emotional goodbyes, no obvious indication that history was about to change forever. Instead, there was normalcy, and sometimes normalcy can be the most heartbreaking thing of all. The witness later admitted that this ordinary quality never stopped haunting them. Every time they replayed the encounter, they found themselves searching for something they might have missed. Some overlooked clue, some unmistakable warning. But the more they reflected, the more they realized a painful truth. Human beings rarely recognize the importance of a moment while they are living through it. Only afterward do certain memories gain extraordinary significance. For the world, Michael Jackson's death became one of the defining cultural moments of the 21st century. News coverage dominated global headlines. Fans gathered outside landmarks across multiple countries. Vigils appeared almost overnight. Millions mourned the loss of an artist whose music had shaped generations. Yet for those who actually knew him, the experience was far more personal. They weren't remembering an icon, they were remembering a person. A colleague, a friend, a father, a performer who spent decades pursuing an impossible standard of perfection. As time passed, debates about his life continued. Discussions about his legacy remained complex. New documentaries, interviews, and investigations ensured that public interest never disappeared. But through all the controversy, one fact remained remarkably consistent. People still wanted to understand who Michael Jackson truly was during his final days. Not the legend, not the headlines, not the public image, the human being behind them all. And perhaps that is why the account of the last person to see him alive continues to fascinate people today. Because it offers a rare glimpse into the final hours of a man the world thought it knew, only to discover that much of him remained a mystery. In the end, the revelation was not a shocking secret or hidden conspiracy. It was something far simpler. The last person to see Michael Jackson alive saw a man still planning for tomorrow. And that may be the most tragic detail of the entire story, because tomorrow never came.